It's a well-known fact that North Africans played a very important role in the creation of the earliest civilizations located in the European islands. These European islands would give birth to some of the craziest civilizations, ones that would have mythological starts, making them one of the heaviest influenced nations of Africa outside of Africa. Not only did they have influence from North Africans, but East and West Africans. This is the island of Crete, off the coast of Europe and Africa. This island is known to have been visited by Africans of all kinds in all times. Seen here are the war machines of Egypt, the people whose reputation flies very deep. This is a painting from Manoa. The Minoan civilization had people of this color, a dark color, but this dark color did not compare to that of the Nubians. The Nubians, of course, running in the back, and as you can see, these people are not wearing shoes, they're not wearing anything, they're basically wearing the same as the Minoans. They are thought to have been the Nubians who from Egypt came into Europe to assess and then help the situation, which war they were involved in, and why they were called so far away from their own home is unknown. Now, why would we say that these are Nubians? Well, two reasons. We find images of Minoans in Egypt, and we know that their language was influenced by the Egyptians, at least their written language. The African component is probably what's responsible for their dark skin. Now, it's a very concerning thing about their DNA and how they operated since they were so commonly represented in ancient Egypt. And it's so obvious to figure out who they are because of the way that they were depicted. Their long hair is obvious, and what they bring to offer is obvious as well. Now, you must remember that a lot of their creations and a lot of the things that they believed in came from another civilization, the Middle East. Egypt, the Middle East, and North Africa tended to be the biggest supplementers of civilization. While wide scale travel from the Middle East was possible, it wasn't exactly the highest quality back in the day. And so having people travel this far makes a statement about how far these people would go in order to make an impact in their very empires and empires scaling the world. It's actually important because we tend to think that communication from long distances is something that is not able or not capable for people in the past. As I talked about in my last video, people still don't know whether or not India and Egypt had communication in ancient times. Now, it must be important to understand that Crete is not so far away from both North Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and the entire continents at the same time. The only continent it seems to be very far away from is the Americas, and it's not guilty of having any influence from there at all. Crete, of course, would play a important role having such a great and, let's say for the time, distinguished civilization. A lot of people think that this travel and this type of communication is something that was maybe in like 200 BC, 300 BC, but really this communication between Europe and Africa started around 4000 BC. And this 4000 BC year trade was small at first and started to grow. This is why, in fact, it's so old, people don't even realize how old the Minoan civilization is compared to ancient Greece, ancient Rome. All of these would not even fall into ancient if the groups were further torn into smaller ones commonly. Now, obviously, they are. Like every other civilization that started to grow in reality, It came down to farming. This is why farming is probably the key defining factor that separates people from advancement and non advancement. On the side, you can see on the walls things that kind of look like tombstones, but they're not, that are like circular. I have no idea what they mean. But if you look in the middle, you can see a dark skinned individual jumping over a bull and two pale skinned individuals, both males, standing on the other side, almost watching. Now, this bull hopping looks very similar to the one that is done in Ethiopia, with obvious Egyptian ties mixed with some images of Nubians, and also the sort of influence of bull hopping. There is some chance that this thing started somewhere within any of these civilizations and then expanded and died out in some places. Now, obviously, it's more likely that it's just a coincidence and that there is nothing to this really. Pottery from as far away as Iran has been found inside of Crete. Now, this place is very far away, but it's also very close in a weird way. These types of communications for places like Persia, places like Egypt, and the Minoans brings up a very big question, which is what does it mean to be a civilization? Usually, when people think of a civilization, they think of writing, they think of high scale pottery, they think of art, they think of things like that. But it seems like the thing that separates a good civilization from a bad civilization is its neighbors. Does it have a well established trade network from around the world that it can draw from and create a civilization of wealth and opulence? I mean, there are many islands inside of Europe or inside of Africa, at least the African island regions or the European island regions, that existed but did not have great trade networks. And therefore, there were just these isolated tribes that did not develop, whether or not they had writing. It does not matter. At some point, being stuck in one place does not help you. 1700 BC, we see this fresco displayed through the Minoan civilization. It is connected to the Akrotiri civilization, and while it's nothing compared to Egypt, it is still a marvel to behold. And I'll tell you why. Because over here we see triple story houses, we see clear signs of intensive labor, high scale pottery, and obviously a predecessor to the civilizations that would come later and add their intensity and their fire inside of their own civilizations, clearly inspired by this one. But there is, of course, a problem, which is this civilization. There was a volcano that happened and buried the entire civilization, which is why it's so well preserved. Some of these things would not even be believable if it wasn't for the fact that they were buried and kept away from disturbances. Looking at the frescoes that are made, you can see it in its vibrancy, looking more like a modern town than an ancient civilization. It's a very striking thing. And of course, the thing that out at me first is how dark they depict themselves. I mean, if you look at the reindeer at the top, right, top corner, you'll see a reindeer, and then you look at their skin color. They are under the impression that they look the same. Another thing that jumps out at me is look at the difference. Now, an idea, a theory, a thought, but it's not proven that one of the reasons why human beings have built upstairs in the past, even before we even knew how to build stone is because it's higher ground and we associated with trees, and that if you're on top of a tree, you're further away from danger. Now, this isn't always the case, but it is the case if your enemies are animals. Outside of the fact that they do not have television, radio, cell phones, the internet, and 100 more inventions, it seems like it would have been a pretty good spot to live in the past. And of course, like I said before, it would not be a surprise that the people living in this civilization who depict themselves in this way with all these trade routes and all of this, it would not be a surprise if a lot of their civilization was born outside of this location. And it would not be a surprise if they brought in a lot of, let's call them tourists. For a long time, it was difficult to imagine that the civilizations located in North Africa would have this much communication with lands this sophisticated and not have sophistication themselves in terms of civilization. I mean, for a very long time, you couldn't even compare Egypt to anything in North Africa, really, in any real sense, until, of course, others started flourishing. But with new and new information, we start to see that North Africa itself has always been a spot of not only trade with Europe, Africa, Egypt, and possibly Asia, but we see that it's always been a spot of sophisticated technology, which stems from its West African connection and then from West Africa to North Africa, connecting itself to other places around the world. The question in hand is, did they trade secrets in order to create these civilizations? For example, did they all develop stone technologies completely on their own? For example, I mean, if you take North Africa and you compare it to Egypt, both of them seem to have stone civilizations, which we do not know if they're all connected, if they all started at the exact same time. Now, you could say, yes, they did develop it independently, but what does that mean? Why is it that there are so many civilizations around the world that do not utilize it in a deeper way? Now, people did move rocks. That's probably the origin and probably the multiple origins of civilizations, that people did move rocks from one place to another and would have very terrible burials where you would put 3 or 4 rocks on top of a dead body and then dogs would come and just dig it up, and then obviously you'd need to put more and more and more, and then the idea would probably strike, like, if you could protect yourself from animals using rocks, then why couldn't you make it bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger? Which brings me to the North African site that is, again, and this is the scary part, it's about the same time as the Minoans, about the same time as Egypt, about the same time as the Sumerians, about the same time as early Middle Eastern civilizations, including some found in Saudi Arabia. They all seem to spring at about the exact same time, with obviously different levels of technology. And more evidence from Morocco is coming out about this civilization that we didn't even know existed until, the last 8 years. This civilization that has now crept up and become the latest in connection between the world's oldest civilizations is a mystery. And everybody loves a good mystery. But it's not only just a mystery because it's in Africa, it's a mystery because no one expected it. People were kind of happy with the image that had been painted of Africa, which is like the Nile Valley birthed African civilizations. That's just a good image. And the rest of Africa, people were living in tents. I mean, the ancient Egyptians say that the people living in North Africa lived in tents as far as the eyes could see, and that their civilization was sprung up or sophisticated by the Egyptians. So why would we believe anything else besides that? But more and more work done makes it very obvious that that is not the case. If we read here, while the North African region's importance during the Iron Age and the Islamic era is well known, researchers said there is a significant gap in knowledge about its archaeology between 4000 BC and 1000 BC. The latest fieldwork carried out at Wad Bet, Morocco, revealed that it was the largest African agricultural complex outside of the Nile region between 3400 BC and 2900 BC. The discovery, researchers said, indicates the presence of a large farming settlement in the region, similar in size to early Bronze Age Troy. Now, you might be thinking, isn't it too early to connect these civilizations together? Isn't it too early to say that there might be some real connection, especially since they seem to have some level of independence? Well, luckily, with the Minoans and the Egyptians depicting other people from the Middle East, there is no guesswork. It is obvious that if they wanted to go to those civilizations, they could have. If they wanted to be in those regions, they could have. And again, probably stemmed by farming, because the one thing that connects all of these is that they developed farming at about the same time. With these type of civilizations, of course, there is the two directional push. We always hear about the one directional push, which is Asians and Mediterraneans entering Africa. We never hear about the other way around, which seems like it should be as common if the corridors opened up due to climate change, which we all know happened. The climate change happened over and over again, and we see these type of paintings that start to utilize paint styles that were first developed in Africa and then would grow beyond. And I don't need to go into it. It's all about the iron oxidized versions of the red ochre and blah 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 blah. We saw in that map that none of that existed until Africans brought it outside of Africa. And then, of course, there are multiple articles and studies on how the Cretans, or the people of Crete, let's not call them Cretans, but the people of Crete had this communication with people from the Mediterranean, obviously, from the Middle East, from Egypt, from North Africa, pottery that is found in those places that still reflects. Now, in this one particular civilization in North Africa, I haven't seen any proof that they've found anything yet, but I know they'll find it. They must find it. It's one of the easiest spots to get to from Europe. Similarities in pottery style between North Africa and Southern Europe have always been pointed out by people, some of them using it to mean that those two civilizations were twin civilizations. But something that they couldn't explain is that there was an additional style of pottery which was more common, which is the type of pottery that you would find in West Africa, which depicts that the type of pottery found inside of North Africa that is of European style is probably traded. In fact, I can't find it now, but there used to be writings that clearly came from Europe in North Africa, but they were clearly not used by the locals for writing. They were clearly just some ostracan that came as junk or as a trade thing, a curiosity for the people living in North Africa, rather than a real life thing that would change the reality of the people living there. And of course, another thing that we're still waiting for is early writing in North Africa. I do not believe that they did not have it. And lastly, and finally, let's just talk about what the study says in the connection of North Africa. Well, I'm going to skip over the entire Mediterranean connection to Crete because that's boring. Proximity makes it very boring. But despite these advances in our understanding of Cretan overseas contacts, The impression of isolation, or at best a passive role for Crete in overseas networks, has not entirely gone away. One reason is the almost complete absence of identifiable Cretan exports during the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. Two exceptional sites where small quantities of Crete pottery were imported in the 6th century, Tokra and Cyrene, on the Libyan coast, Libya, of course, being in North Africa, have been interpreted as evidence of a North African terminus of a Peloponnesian trade network, a particular directional route along with Greek merchants heading for Egyptian grain markets stopped on Crete. Southern Peloponnesians North African network, or at the very least, some sites on western end of the island served as an intermediaries or transit ports of coal before the archaeological evidence for a North African route. Viviers as was one of the few scholars to explore the possibility that maritime trade had an impact on the economy of some communities on Crete, but his emphasis was on the Hellenistic period. We all know that man built the boat so they can go over the waters, and when we see boats, we know that they must have traveled over the waters. These writings, this pottery, this, by the way, anyone who's thinking we just have pottery, yeah, food and stuff like that, that would be the biggest level of trade, goes away very quickly. And I'm not talking about it lands on the ground and decays. People eat it. So it's unfortunate that most of the trade goods would have been dissolved or completely washed away by the time that this happened. But it leaves us with obvious connections between all of these civilizations, although we know that they independently started, which is weird. It's a weird thing. It's like as soon as they start communicating with one another because they all had boats of different types, whether made of reeds, whether made of sticks, whether made of pure bark, whether sophisticated or not, tied by ropes, using copper nails, whatever is happening, the connection seems to be there. Like, share, subscribe, and don't forget to look at the previous video about communication with India and East Africa. It will tell you a lot more about communication in history than with this civilization. It builds a circle. You will start to notice that there's a circle of trade. Now, one that I need to talk about later is the pre Swahili tradition, where they communicated with people in the South, people from India connected with people in the pre Swahili civilization, which is strange.